Before I tell you anything else, I want you to do something for me right now. Think about the last time you felt truly financially comfortable. Not rich, not vacation planning wealthy, just comfortable. That moment when you checked your bank account and didn't feel that little knot in your stomach. For some of you watching this, that moment was last week. For others, it was last year. And for far too many Americans right now, you're struggling to remember if that moment ever existed at all. Here's what nobody is telling you about the cost of living crisis in America. This isn't just about numbers getting bigger. This isn't just about inflation or interest rates or whatever buzzword economists are throwing around this month. What's happening right now is something far more insidious. The American economic system is fundamentally restructuring itself in a way that takes something precious from you every single day. And most people don't even realize what's being stolen until it's too late. It's not just your money. It's your time. It's your energy. It's your ability to build a future that looks different from your present. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how this invisible tax works, why it's getting worse, and most importantly, what it means for every decision you make from this moment forward. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see every dollar you earn and every choice you make about your financial future. Let me start with a truth that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. The American economy you were promised, the one your parents or grandparents experienced, the one where hard work automatically translated into upward mobility, that economy doesn't exist anymore. And I'm not being dramatic. I'm being precise. Something fundamental shifted in the architecture of how Americans build wealth, and it happened so gradually that most people are only now starting to feel the full weight of it. Think about it this way. When someone tells you to work harder, to budget better, to make smarter choices, they're operating under the assumption that the game board hasn't changed. But what if the entire game board has been redesigned while you were playing? What if the rules that governed economic success for the past 50 years have been quietly rewritten, and nobody sent you the updated manual? Here's what I mean by invisible restructuring. In previous generations, there was a relatively predictable relationship between effort and economic outcome. You got an education, you secured employment, you saved consistently, and those savings eventually translated into tangible assets. A home, a car that didn't break down every 3 months. Maybe some investments. The system had friction, absolutely, but the basic mechanical relationship between input and output was relatively stable. Now that mechanical relationship has been fundamentally altered. Americans today are working more hours, with more education, in a more productive economy than at any point in modern history. Yet the conversion rate between that effort and economic security has deteriorated dramatically. You're putting in the same work, sometimes more work, but the output on the other end keeps shrinking. The payoff keeps getting pushed further into the future, and for many Americans, that future payoff never actually arrives. This isn't about individual failure. This is about systemic transformation. The costs of the basic building blocks of middle-class life have increased at rates that completely outpace wage growth. We're not talking about luxury items or optional expenses. We're talking about housing, healthcare, education, transportation, and energy. The non-negotiable foundations of participating in modern American society. When these foundations become prohibitively expensive relative to income, you don't just have people who are struggling. You have an entire generation that is locked out of the wealth-building mechanisms that previous generations took for granted. And this is where the invisible tax comes in. When your rent increases by 15%, but your salary increases by 3%, that gap isn't just a financial inconvenience. That gap represents stolen potential. That's money that could have gone toward building equity, investing in skills, creating opportunities, or simply providing the breathing room necessary to make strategic life decisions rather than desperate ones. Instead, that money vanishes into the gap between what you earn and what survival costs, and it takes your future possibilities with it. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in these cost of living conversations, and that's the phenomenon I call the compression of American life. What do I mean by compression? I mean the systematic elimination of space between different life stages and economic categories. Let me explain this more clearly. In a healthy economy, there are distinct phases of financial life. There's the struggling phase when you're just starting out. There's the building phase when you're establishing stability. There's the advancing phase when you're accumulating assets and opportunities. And there's the secure phase when you've built enough buffer to weather disruptions and plan for the future. These phases still technically exist, but the space between them has compressed to the point where millions of Americans are experiencing all of them simultaneously or none of them at all. You have people in their 30s and 40s, people who, by traditional metrics, should be well into the building or advancing phase, who are still living paycheck to paycheck. They have advanced degrees, professional jobs, years of experience, and yet they're making the same survival mode decisions that are supposed to characterize your early 20s. The compression means there's no longer a clear pathway from struggling to secure. Instead, there's this vast middle category of people who are permanently stuck in what I call the grinding phase. They're working, they're responsible, they're doing everything they're supposed to do, but they're running on a treadmill that never actually moves them forward. They're too financially stretched to build real savings, too burdened with existing obligations to take risks that might lead to advancement, and too exhausted from maintaining their current position to invest in the kinds of activities that create future opportunities. This compression affects every aspect of decision-making. People are delaying or completely abandoning major life milestones because the financial foundation required to support those milestones keeps receding further into the distance. Starting a family becomes a luxury decision rather than a natural life progression. Changing careers to pursue more meaningful work becomes impossible because you can't afford the temporary income disruption. Moving to a city with better opportunities becomes unthinkable because the cost of entry is too high. Even smaller decisions get compressed. Can you afford to take a day off when you're sick? Can you buy the healthier food option? Or do you need to choose the cheaper, less nutritious alternative? Can you invest in preventive health care? Or do you wait until something becomes an emergency? Every single one of these decisions represents a trade-off between your present survival and your future well-being. And when you're forced to make these trade-offs constantly, day after day, year after year, it fundamentally alters the trajectory of your entire life. The psychological impact of this compression cannot be overstated. When people feel like they're working hard but getting nowhere, when they see others who started with more advantages pulling further ahead, when they realize that the promised correlation between effort and reward has broken down, it creates a profound sense of betrayal and hopelessness. And that hopelessness isn't irrational. It's not a character flaw. It's a rational response to a system that is systematically failing to deliver on its fundamental promise. The promise that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll be able to build a decent life. That promise has been broken for millions of Americans, and the compression of economic life is both the cause and the consequence of that broken promise. Let's get specific about the single largest driver of this economic compression, and that's housing. I'm going to walk you through exactly how the housing crisis functions as a wealth extraction mechanism and a generational trap. And I want to be very clear about this. The housing crisis isn't just about high prices. It's about the complete transformation of housing from a consumer good into a financial asset class. And that transformation has created a system where housing simultaneously serves as the primary vehicle for wealth building and the primary barrier to entering wealth building in the first place. Here's the mechanism. For previous generations, housing was expensive, yes, but it was expensive in a way that was proportional to income. The standard metric used to be that housing costs should represent roughly 30% of your gross income. That was considered the healthy maximum. Anything above that was considered cost-burdened. Today, millions of Americans are spending 40, 50, even 60% of their income on housing, and that's not because they're making bad choices. It's because the supply-demand dynamics of housing have been fundamentally distorted. Multiple forces conspired to create this distortion. After the housing crash in 2008, construction of new homes slowed dramatically and never fully recovered. America has been underbuilding housing relative to population growth for over a decade. At the same time, housing transformed into an investment vehicle for both individual investors and large institutional players. When homes are purchased, not to live in, but to extract rental income or appreciation, it removes housing stock from the owner-occupant market and converts it into a revenue-generating asset. This is crucial to understand. Every home that becomes a rental property is a home that a potential buyer cannot purchase. And when you can't purchase, you're forced to rent, which means your housing costs become a permanent expense rather than a temporary cost that eventually converts into equity. Now layer onto this the interest rate environment. When mortgage rates were at historic lows, people who already owned homes or who could qualify for mortgages locked in incredibly favorable long-term financing. But when rates climbed back up to 6 and 7%, it created a lock-in effect. People who wanted to sell and buy something different couldn't afford to give up their low-rate mortgage, so they stayed put. This reduced the available inventory even further, driving prices higher for the shrinking pool of homes that were actually available. The result is a market where prices remain elevated not because of healthy demand dynamics, but because of structural constraints that prevent normal market clearing. And here's where the wealth lock comes in. Home equity has historically been the primary mechanism through which average Americans build wealth. You buy a home, you pay down the mortgage over time. The home appreciates in value, and by the time you reach retirement age, you have a significant asset that represents decades of forced savings. This system worked reasonably well when homes were accessible to people in their 20s and early 30s. It breaks down completely when the average first-time home buyer is now in their mid-30s, and a growing percentage of Americans are unable to buy homes at all. When you're locked out of home ownership, you're locked out of the primary wealth-building mechanism available to average Americans. You're not building equity. You're transferring money to someone else who is building equity. Your housing costs represent pure consumption rather than investment. This creates a compounding divergence. The people who own homes continue to accumulate wealth through appreciation and equity building. The people who don't own homes fall further behind because they're spending an ever-increasing share of their income on rent while building nothing. Over the course of a lifetime, this divergence translates into wealth gaps measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. And because wealth is intergenerational, meaning it gets passed down through inheritance and family support, this creates permanent class stratification. The children of homeowners will have advantages that the children of renters will never have. They'll have help with down payments. They'll have safety nets during economic disruptions. They'll have family wealth to draw on for education, business ventures, and emergencies. The children of renters will have none of these advantages, and they'll be competing in the same economic system against people who do. This is how temporary disadvantage becomes permanent inequality. This is how the housing crisis transforms into a mechanism for locking in class divisions across generations. Now, if housing was the only problem, it would be bad enough. But there's another dimension to this crisis that compounds everything else: And that's what I call the utility multiplier and the cost cascade. Let me explain how this works. Once you secure housing, whether through renting or owning, you haven't actually solved your cost of living problem. You've just unlocked the next level of mandatory expenses. And these expenses have been growing even faster than housing in many parts of the country. I'm talking about utilities, primarily electricity, but also water, gas, and internet, which has now become as essential as electricity for participating in modern economic life. Here's what's happening with utilities that most people don't fully understand. Energy costs are highly variable based on geography, climate, infrastructure age, and regulatory environment. In some parts of the country, particularly in the South and areas vulnerable to climate disruption, electricity bills have skyrocketed to levels that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. We're seeing families with monthly electric bills of $500, $600, even $700 during peak summer or winter months. These aren't people running industrial operations out of their homes. These are normal families trying to keep their living spaces at survivable temperatures. The problem is that energy consumption isn't really optional. You can cut back to some degree, but there's a floor below which you cannot go without sacrificing basic health and safety. You need climate control. You need refrigeration for food. You need hot water. You need lighting. These are non-negotiable elements of modern life. What makes this particularly insidious is the cascade effect. When your electricity bill jumps by $200 in a single month, that's $200 that can't go toward other necessities. Maybe it comes out of your grocery budget, so you eat worse food, which affects your health, which leads to medical costs down the line. Maybe it comes out of your car maintenance budget, so you defer that oil change, which leads to more expensive repairs later. Maybe it comes out of your minimal savings, so when the next unexpected expense hits, you have no buffer, and you're forced to use credit, which means you're now paying interest on top of everything else. This is the cost cascade. One spike in one essential category triggers a chain reaction of compromises and deferred maintenance across your entire financial life. And the more compressed your budget already is, the more destructive this cascade becomes. Transportation costs work exactly the same way. For millions of Americans, particularly those living in areas without robust public transit, a car isn't a luxury. It's the prerequisite for employment. You need a car to get to work. You need a car to get to the grocery store. You need a car to handle the basic logistics of existence. But car ownership has become staggeringly expensive. The average car payment in America is now over $500 a month. Insurance, especially in high-risk states like Florida, can easily run another $200 to $300 monthly. Then you have gas, maintenance, registration, and repairs. A reliable vehicle can easily cost someone $800 to $1,000 per month when you account for all these factors. And if you can't afford a reliable vehicle, you end up in an even worse situation. You buy a cheaper, older car that breaks down constantly. Every breakdown costs you in repairs, in missed work, in stress and uncertainty. You end up paying more over time because you can't afford the upfront cost of reliability. This is the poverty trap in microcosm. The cost of being poor is higher than the cost of being middle class, and the cost of being middle class is higher than the cost of being wealthy. When you have capital, you can buy quality once. When you don't have capital, you end up buying cheap replacements over and over, and the cumulative cost exceeds what the quality option would have cost. This applies to cars, appliances, clothing, housing, everything. The utility multiplier and the cost cascade ensure that once you fall behind, catching up becomes exponentially harder. Every dollar that goes to managing crises is a dollar that can't go toward preventing future crises. You're trapped in a permanent reactive mode, constantly dealing with the consequences of not being able to afford prevention. I want to spend the final part of this video talking about something that economic analysis usually ignores, and that's the psychological cost of living in permanent financial precarity. Because here's what the numbers and the policy discussions miss. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, when you're constantly making impossible choices between necessities, when you're watching your efforts fail to translate into progress, it doesn't just affect your bank account. It fundamentally rewires how you think, how you make decisions, and how you envision your future. And these psychological effects create their own economic consequences that trap people even further. Let me describe what I call survival mode economics. When you're in survival mode, your time horizon collapses. You can't think about where you want to be in 5 years because you're trying to figure out how to make it through the next 2 weeks. Long-term planning requires a degree of stability and predictability that you simply don't have. Investment in future returns, whether that's education, skill development, networking, or even basic health maintenance, becomes impossible because you need every resource you have to handle immediate demands. This creates a vicious cycle. The inability to invest in your future ensures that your future will look exactly like your present, which means you'll continue to be trapped in survival mode indefinitely. The cognitive load of financial stress is also massively underestimated. When you're constantly worried about money, when every decision requires complex mental calculation about trade-offs and consequences, when you're carrying the weight of unpaid bills and mounting obligations, it occupies enormous mental bandwidth. Studies have shown that financial stress reduces cognitive capacity by the equivalent of a significant IQ drop. You're literally less able to think clearly, make good decisions, and solve problems when you're under constant financial pressure. This isn't a moral failing. This is a biological response to chronic stress. Your brain is operating in crisis mode, which means it prioritizes immediate threat response over everything else. And in that state, making the kinds of careful, strategic decisions that would improve your situation long-term becomes neurologically difficult. There's also the social isolation that comes with financial struggle. When you can't afford to participate in social activities, when you have to decline invitations because you can't pay for meals out or events, when you're embarrassed about your situation and withdraw to avoid judgment, you lose access to social capital. And social capital matters enormously for economic opportunity. Jobs often come through networks. Opportunities emerge through connections. Support during crises comes from relationships. When financial stress erodes your social connections, it cuts you off from one of the most important resources for economic advancement. You become isolated precisely when you most need community and support. Perhaps most damaging is the erosion of hope and agency. When you work hard and still fall behind, when you do everything right and still struggle, when you see the gap between your efforts and your outcomes growing wider, it creates a profound sense of powerlessness. And powerlessness leads to resignation. Why bother trying if the system is rigged? Why make sacrifices if they don't lead anywhere? This psychological state isn't laziness or lack of ambition. It's learned helplessness, a rational response to a situation where your actions don't meaningfully change your circumstances. And once learned helplessness sets in, it becomes self-fulfilling. You stop trying because trying hasn't worked, and because you stop trying, things get worse, which reinforces the belief that trying is pointless. So where does this leave us? I've spent the last 30 minutes walking you through the mechanics of how America's cost of living crisis functions as an invisible tax on your future. We've explored the systematic restructuring of the American economy, the compression of economic life, the housing trap and wealth lock, the utility multiplier and cost cascade, and the psychological economics of survival mode. If you're feeling overwhelmed right now, that's appropriate. This is overwhelming. But understanding the system is the first step to not being crushed by it. You can't fight what you don't understand. You can't adapt to changes you don't see. And you can't make strategic decisions when you're operating with an outdated map of economic reality. The America we were promised is gone. The rules have changed. The question now is, what do you do with that knowledge? How do you build a life worth living in an economic system that seems designed to extract rather than enable? That's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves, but at least now you're asking the right question. Because the real cost of living in America isn't just measured in dollars. It's measured in dreams deferred, potential unrealized, and futures stolen one impossible choice at a time.